The blizzard hit without warning on the morning of December 3rd, 1873, turning the mountain pass between Oregon and California into a white wall of death that swallowed everything in its path. Eleanor Carver stumbled through drifts that reached her knees, clutching her infant son against her chest beneath her threadbare coat, her fingers so numb she could no longer feel if she still had a grip on him. She had been walking for 2 days since the wagon train left her behind, since the fever took her husband, and the other families decided a widow with a crying baby was too much of a burden to keep. Every step felt like her last, but she kept pushing forward because stopping meant dying, and her boy deserved better than freezing to death in the wilderness before he even turned 6 months old. Her vision blurred as the snow pelted her face, ice crystals stinging like tiny knives. The baby had stopped crying an hour ago, gone terribly quiet inside the cocoon of blankets she had wrapped around him, and that silence terrified her more than anything else in this God-forsaken landscape. She tried to call his name, tried to say Thomas, but her lips would not form the word anymore. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she fell forward into the snow, twisting her body at the last second so she would take the impact instead of her child. The cold enveloped her like water, soaking through her clothes, stealing the last remnants of warmth from her bones. She tried to push herself up, but her arms would not obey. The world tilted sideways, going gray at the edges, and she thought this must be what dying felt like. Jackson Ellis had been tracking the elk for 3 miles when he saw the dark shape in the snow ahead. At first, he thought it might be the animal he had been following, brought down by the storm, but as his horse picked its way closer through the drifts, he realized with a jolt that it was a person. He dismounted before his mare even stopped moving, his boots sinking deep into the powder as he ran the last few yards. A woman lay face down in the snow, her dark hair fanned out around her head like a crow's wing, and for a terrible moment he thought she was already gone. Then he saw the bundle clutched beneath her, saw the tiny movement of fabric, and understood. He dropped to his knees beside her and carefully turned her over. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as death, but when he pressed his fingers to her throat he felt the faint flutter of a pulse. The baby started crying then, a thin wail that was the most beautiful sound Jackson had heard in months. He gathered them both into his arms, surprised by how light she was, how fragile she felt beneath the layers of frozen clothing. His horse stamped nervously as he approached, but Copper was a steady animal and held still, while Jackson positioned the woman across the saddle, keeping the baby pressed between them where his body heat could reach the child. His cabin was 2 miles south, built into the side of a hill where the mountains gave way to the forests that surrounded Eureka. He had been living alone for 4 years, ever since he left Texas and the memories of the war behind, and in all that time, he had never been so grateful for the isolation. He could work without interruption now, could get them inside and warm without having to explain or ask for help. The ride felt endless, the woman's body limp against him, the baby's cries growing weaker. He talked to them both, nonsense words meant to keep himself calm as much as them, promising warmth and safety and hot soup if they could just hold on a little longer. The cabin appeared through the snow like a miracle, smoke still rising from the chimney where he had banked the fire before leaving that morning. He kicked the door open and brought them straight to the hearth, laying the woman on the rug in front of the flames. Her lips were moving, trying to form words, but no sound came out. The baby had gone quiet again, and Jackson felt a spike of fear as he unwrapped the blankets. The child was a boy, maybe 6 months old, with his mother's dark hair and skin cold enough to make Jackson's heart clench. But his chest rose and fell, and when Jackson rubbed the tiny hands between his own, the baby's eyes fluttered open. He had never undressed a woman before, not like this, with clinical efficiency and no thought beyond survival. Her clothes were soaked through, frozen in places, and he had to use his knife to cut away the worst of it. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, then heated water and used clean cloths to warm her hands and feet, rubbing circulation back into the frozen flesh. The baby he wrapped in soft flannel and held against his chest, his own body heat the best source of warmth he could offer. It took an hour before the woman's shivering started, violent tremors that shook her whole body, and Jackson knew that was a good sign. Dead people did not shiver. He made broth from the venison he had hanging in the cold room, weak and easy to digest. And when the woman's eyes finally opened near sunset, he carefully spooned small amounts between her lips. She choked on the first mouthful, her eyes wild with confusion and fear, but he kept his voice low and steady, telling her she was safe, that her baby was alive and warm. That seemed to reach her through the fog of hypothermia, and she let him continue feeding her, her gaze darting constantly to the bundle by the fire where her son slept. 3 days passed before she could speak more than a few words at a time. Jackson learned her name was Eleanor, that she had been heading to Sacramento where her sister lived, that her husband had died of fever outside of Portland. She did not talk about the wagon train that abandoned her, but he saw the pain in her eyes when he asked how she ended up alone in the mountains. He wanted to ride out and find those people, wanted to make them answer for leaving a woman and baby to die, but the storm had not let up and leaving Eleanor alone was not an option. He slept in the chair by the fire those first nights, watching over them both, feeding the baby when he cried, because Eleanor was too weak to sit up. He had no experience with infants, had never thought he would hold one in his arms, but Thomas fit perfectly in the crook of his elbow, and there was something profound about watching those tiny fingers curl around his thumb. Eleanor watched him with an expression he could not read, something between gratitude and sorrow, and he wondered what she saw when she looked at him. Just another stranger who had pulled her back from death's door, or something more. By the end of the first week, she was strong enough to move around the cabin, though she tired easily, and her fingers still bore the angry red marks of frostbite. She insisted on helping with meals, on taking care of Thomas herself, and Jackson let her because he understood the need to feel useful, to reclaim some measure of control after nearly dying. They moved around each other carefully in the small space, 2 people learning each other's rhythms, figuring out how to share a life neither of them had planned. The storm finally broke on the 10th day, leaving the world outside buried under 4 feet of snow that glittered like diamonds in the winter sun. Jackson spent the morning digging out paths to the woodshed and the small barn where he kept Copper and the milk cow. When he came back inside, stamping snow from his boots, he found Eleanor sitting by the window with Thomas in her arms, singing softly. The sound stopped him in his tracks, something in his chest tightening at the picture they made, mother and child bathed in pale light. She looked up and caught him staring, and for a moment neither of them looked away. That night, after Thomas fell asleep and the fire burned low, they finally talked about what came next. Eleanor needed to get to Sacramento, to her sister who was expecting her before Christmas. Jackson pointed out that Christmas was 2 weeks away and the passes would not be clear for at least a month, maybe longer. She could stay here until spring, he said, until travel was safe again. He saw the conflict in her face, the war between proper behavior and practical necessity, and he knew what was holding her back. "I do not expect anything from you," he said, keeping his eyes on the fire. "You can have the bed, I will sleep out here. You are safe here, Eleanor." "I swear it on my life." She was quiet for a long time before she answered. "Why did you come looking that day? In all that snow, what made you ride out?" "I was tracking an elk," he said. "Needed meat for winter, but I think maybe I was meant to be there, meant to find you." "I do not believe in fate," she said softly. "I think we make our own paths. Then maybe you were meant to keep walking just long enough to cross mine." She smiled at that, and it was the first real smile he had seen from her, the kind that reached her eyes and lit up her whole face. "Maybe," she said. Winter deepened around the cabin, turning the world into a pristine wilderness of white and silence. Jackson taught Eleanor how to shoot his rifle, insisting she needed to know how to protect herself if something ever happened to him. She was a quick study, her hands steady on the weapon despite the cold, and she hit the target more often than not by the end of the first week. He showed her how to read the weather, how to tell when more snow was coming by the way the chickadees flocked to the feeder. She taught him songs her mother had sung to her in Ireland, before the family came to America, before fever took her parents and left Eleanor to make her own way in the world. Thomas grew stronger every day, his cheeks filling out with healthy color, his laugh a bright sound that filled the cabin with joy. He took to Jackson immediately, reaching for him whenever he came near, babbling sounds that might have been words or might have been pure happiness. Eleanor watched them together with something soft in her expression, and Jackson tried not to think too hard about what it meant that playing with her son felt more natural than anything he had done in years. They fell into a routine that felt like marriage without any of the vows. Eleanor cooked while Jackson handled the outdoor work, checking his traps and hunting when the weather permitted. They ate together at the rough-hewn table, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories. He told her about Texas, about the ranch his family had owned before the war, about coming home to find it burned and his parents in the ground. She told him about working as a seamstress in Portland, about meeting her husband David at church and thinking maybe she had found safety, only to lose him 6 months after Thomas was born. One night in late January, Eleanor woke to find the cabin empty except for Thomas sleeping in his cradle. She pulled on Jackson's spare coat and stepped outside into cold so intense it burned her lungs. She found him standing in the snow, staring up at stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. He turned when he heard her approach, and even in the darkness she could see something raw in his face. "Could not sleep," he said simply. "Bad dreams." She knew about those, about waking in the dark with her heart racing, David's death replaying behind her eyes. "Just thinking," he said, "about how empty this place was before you came." She moved closer, near enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Jackson, I need to tell you something. My sister in Sacramento, I have not heard from her in over a year. I do not know if she is even there anymore." That was just the only destination I could think of when the wagon train asked where I was headed. He absorbed this information silently, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. "So you have nowhere to go." "I have nowhere to go," she confirmed. "I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid you would think I was taking advantage of your kindness." "Eleanor, look at me." He waited until her eyes met his. "I am glad you have nowhere to go. I know I should not be, I know that makes me selfish, but I am glad you are here and I hope you stay." The confession hung between them, honest and vulnerable, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. She had been trying so hard not to acknowledge what was growing between them, trying to remember that she was a widow who barely escaped death, that he was a stranger who owed her nothing. But standing here in the frozen night with starlight reflected in his eyes, she could not pretend any more. "I think I am falling in love with you," she whispered. "And it terrifies me because David has only been gone 3 months and I should still be mourning." Jackson reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not, he cupped her face with his bare hand. His palm was warm against her cold cheek. "David was your husband and you loved him. That does not stop just because he is gone. But Eleanor, you are alive. We are both alive, and that has to count for something." She kissed him then, rising up on her toes to press her mouth to his, and it felt like coming home and leaping off a cliff all at once. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and they stood there in the snow kissing like they were the only two people left in the world. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor was crying and laughing at the same time. "I do not know how to do this," she said. "I do not know how to love someone again." "Then we will figure it out together," Jackson said, and kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the tip of her cold nose. "We will take it slow as you need." They went back inside and sat by the fire, Eleanor curled against Jackson's chest, his arms wrapped around her. They talked until dawn, about fears and hopes and what a future might look like. Thomas woke with the sun, crying for his breakfast, and they moved apart to start the day. But something had fundamentally changed. A door had opened that neither of them wanted to close again. February brought a brief thaw, the snow melting enough that Jackson could ride down to Eureka for supplies. He asked Eleanor if she wanted to come, but she said she preferred to stay at the cabin with Thomas where it was warm. He understood she was not ready to face the world yet, to field questions about who she was and where she came from. He made the trip alone, his saddlebags loaded with furs to trade, and came back with flour and sugar and coffee, with fabric for new dresses and a wooden rattle for Thomas that made the baby shriek with delight. He also brought back news that the railroad was pushing through, that Eureka was growing now that the mines were producing again, that there was talk of statehood and civilization, and all the things that came with Eastern money. Eleanor listened to these stories with interest, but she did not ask when the passes would clear, did not mention Sacramento again. Jackson took that as a good sign. March arrived with rain that washed away the last of the winter snow, revealing the world beneath. Green shoots pushed up through dead grass, and the first wildflowers appeared in sheltered spots near the cabin. Eleanor helped Jackson plant a garden, turning the soil with her hands while Thomas watched from a blanket in the sun. She was smiling more now, the haunted look fading from her eyes, and when Jackson came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, she leaned back into him without hesitation. "Marry me," he said into her hair. It was not how he had planned to ask, had not even known he was going to say it until the words were already out, but they felt right. Eleanor went very still in his arms. "Jackson, I know it has not been long. I know people will talk, will say it is too soon after David. But Eleanor, I love you. I love Thomas. I want to build a life with you, a real life, not just something we are pretending at until you decide to leave." She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. Her eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." They rode down to Eureka the next week. Thomas bundled between them on the saddle, and found the circuit preacher who came through once a month. Reverend Matthews asked the standard questions, satisfied himself that Eleanor was indeed a widow and free to remarry, and married them in the small church with 3 townspeople as witnesses. Eleanor wore the blue dress Jackson had bought for her, the color bringing out her eyes, and she had never looked more beautiful. Jackson wore his only suit, brushed clean and smelling faintly of cedar, and his hands shook when he slipped the simple gold band on her finger. They celebrated with dinner at the hotel restaurant, a luxury neither of them could really afford, but Jackson insisted on anyway. Thomas sat in Eleanor's lap, trying to grab everything on the table, and they laughed at his antics like the happy family they had become. Walking back to where they had left Copper at the livery, Eleanor's hand tucked into the crook of Jackson's arm, they passed a photographer's studio. Jackson pulled her inside before she could protest, and they sat for a portrait, their first as husband and wife. The photographer positioned them carefully, Jackson standing behind Eleanor's chair with his hand on her shoulder, Thomas in her lap reaching for the camera. The magnesium flash made them all blink, but when they saw the finished photograph a week later, it captured something essential about them, about the love and hope in their faces. Spring turned to summer, and Jackson's cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a home. Eleanor made curtains for the windows, planted flowers around the door, turned the rough bachelor existence into something warm and welcoming. She was pregnant by July, a fact she suspected long before the doctor in Eureka confirmed it. Jackson was ecstatic, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around until she begged him to stop before she got dizzy. Thomas was walking now, toddling around the cabin getting into everything, and the thought of another child joining their family felt like a blessing. The baby came in late February of 1875, a daughter they named Sarah after Jackson's mother. The birth was long and difficult, and there were hours when Jackson paced the cabin floor, terrified he was going to lose Eleanor the same way he had nearly lost her in the snow. But she was strong, stronger than anyone he had ever known, and when Sarah's first cry split the air, Eleanor was laughing through her tears of relief. Jackson held his daughter with shaking hands, marveling at her tiny fingers and the tuft of red hair that marked her as his, and felt his heart expand to hold this new love. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to touch her constantly, to bring her his toys and show her everything he found interesting. Eleanor watched them together with joy in her eyes, and Jackson knew she was thinking about how close they had come to never having this, to dying in that snowstorm before any of it could happen. He thought about it too sometimes, about the sheer chance of being in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. Maybe Eleanor was right, and there was no such thing as fate, but it was hard not to believe in something larger when he looked at his family. They expanded the cabin that summer, Jackson and 3 men from town adding 2 more rooms and a proper kitchen. The work was hard but satisfying, and Eleanor insisted on helping where she could, handing up nails and holding boards steady while Jackson hammered. By autumn, they had a home that could hold their growing family comfortably, with space for more children if they were blessed. The garden produced more vegetables than they could eat, and Eleanor spent weeks canning and preserving, filling the cellar with jars that glowed like jewels in the lamplight. Thomas started talking in complete sentences that fall, his vocabulary growing daily as he followed Jackson around asking endless questions. Why did the chickens lay eggs? Where did the deer go in winter? Why was the sky blue? Jackson answered every question with patience, remembering his own father doing the same, and felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders in the best possible way. He was a father now, a husband, a man with people depending on him. It was everything he had thought he lost when the war took his family. Winter came again, but this time they were prepared. The cellar was stocked, the woodshed overflowing, the animals settled in the barn with plenty of feed. When the first snow fell in early December, Eleanor stood at the window watching it come down, Thomas on her hip and Sarah sleeping against her shoulder. Jackson came up behind them, wrapping his arms around all 3, and she leaned back into his warmth. "You remember?" he asked softly. "2 years ago, almost to the day." "I remember," she said. "I remember thinking I was going to die, that Thomas was going to die, and then suddenly you were there." "Best elk I never caught," he said, and she laughed. "Jackson Ellis, you are a terrible romantic." "I am trying," he protested. What do you want me to say? That finding you was like finding a piece of myself I did not know was missing. That every day with you feels like a gift I do not deserve." She turned in his arms, careful not to wake Sarah, and kissed him softly. "That is better," she whispered against his lips. "Much better." That Christmas was the happiest either of them could remember. They cut a small pine tree and decorated it with strings of dried berries and paper stars Thomas helped make. Jackson carved wooden toys for the children, a horse for Thomas and a doll cradle for Sarah, even though she was too young to appreciate it yet. Eleanor baked cakes and cookies with the precious sugar Jackson had bought in town, and the cabin smelled like heaven for days. On Christmas morning, they exchanged simple gifts, practical things mostly, but the love behind them made each one precious. The years that followed were not without hardship. There were droughts that threatened the garden, winters that tested their preparations, illnesses that had Eleanor pacing the floor with a feverish child in her arms. Jackson broke his leg falling from the barn roof the summer Thomas turned 4, and Eleanor had to run the place alone for 2 months while he healed. But they weathered every crisis together, their love deepening with each challenge overcome. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved books and learning, who could track a deer through the forest with his father but also spent hours reading by the fire. Sarah was his opposite, wild and fearless, climbing trees and catching frogs and driving her mother to distraction with her antics. A third child joined them in 1878, a boy they named James who had Jackson's red hair and Eleanor's dark eyes. He was a happy baby who laughed at everything, and his joy was infectious. By 1880, Jackson had saved enough to buy the land their cabin sat on, making it officially theirs. He filed the deed at the land office in Eureka, Eleanor's name beside his, and felt the satisfaction of truly owning something, of putting down roots that could not be pulled up. They were not wealthy, probably never would be, but they had enough. They had each other, had healthy children, had a home filled with love and laughter. It was more than either of them had dared dream about in the dark days before they found each other. Eleanor sometimes thought about David, about the life she might have had if he had lived. She had loved him, truly loved him, but it had been a gentle love, a safe love, nothing like the passionate devotion she felt for Jackson. She did not feel guilty about it anymore, had made peace with the fact that she could honor David's memory while building a new life. She visited his grave once, years after they married, making the trip to Portland with Jackson and the children. She brought flowers and told him about Thomas, about the man who saved them both, about the happiness she had found. She liked to think David would have been glad for her, that he would have wanted her to live rather than spend her life mourning. Thomas was 10 the summer Jackson taught him to break horses, working with the mustangs he caught in the hills and trained for sale. The boy had his mother's patience and his father's steady hands, and he took to the work naturally. Sarah, now 8, was more interested in learning to shoot, and she could hit a target from 50 yards by the time she was 9. James was still young, only 5, but he already showed signs of being a builder, always constructing elaborate structures from whatever materials he could find. Eleanor's hair was starting to gray at the temples by her 35th year, though Jackson insisted it made her look distinguished. He still looked at her like she was the most beautiful woman in the world, still pulled her into his arms for stolen kisses when the children were not looking, still made her feel like a bride sometimes. She loved him with an intensity that had not dimmed over the years, that grew stronger with every shared sunrise, every crisis overcome together, every quiet moment by the fire after the children were asleep. The summer of 1885 brought unexpected visitors to their door. A wagon rolled up the path to the cabin, and Eleanor's heart stopped when she saw the woman who climbed down from the driver's seat. Margaret, her sister from Sacramento, older and grayer than Eleanor remembered, but unmistakably her sister. They stared at each other for a long moment before Margaret burst into tears and rushed forward to embrace Eleanor. "I thought you were dead," Margaret sobbed. "When you never arrived, when winter came and went with no word, I thought you had died on the journey." Eleanor held her sister tight, her own tears flowing freely. "I almost did. I would have if not for Jackson." Margaret stayed for 2 weeks, getting to know the family she thought she had lost. She brought news from Sacramento, stories about her own husband and children, and slowly the sisters rebuilt the connection that had been severed by time and distance. When Margaret finally left, promising to visit every year, Eleanor stood in the yard waving until the wagon disappeared from sight. "You could have gone with her," Jackson said that night, holding Eleanor close. "Could have had the city life, the society and culture you gave up to stay here." Eleanor pulled back to look at him, cupping his face with both hands. "Jackson Ellis, I am exactly where I want to be. I have been exactly where I wanted to be since the day I woke up in front of your fire and saw you holding my son. This is my home. You are my home." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and she felt the same spark that had been there from the beginning. Some things never changed, never faded, and this love they had built from tragedy and chance was one of them. Thomas left for university in San Francisco the autumn he turned 18, bright and ambitious, and eager to see the world beyond the mountains. It broke Eleanor's heart a little to watch him go, but she was proud of the man he had become, proud that he had opportunities she and Jackson had never dreamed of. Sarah announced she wanted to be a doctor, shocking everyone, and began studying with the physician in Eureka, learning everything he would teach her. James apprenticed with a carpenter in town, his talent for building finding practical application. By 1890, Jackson and Eleanor were in their early 40s, the cabin quiet now that the children were grown and pursuing their own dreams. They talked about moving to town, about selling the place and retiring somewhere less isolated, but neither of them could quite let go. This was where their life together had started, where they had built everything that mattered. The memories were in every log, every stone, every tree in the yard. They stood outside one December evening, watching snow fall just like it had fallen 17 years before. Eleanor was tucked under Jackson's arm, both of them bundled in heavy coats, and the silence was comfortable and complete. "You ever regret it?" Jackson asked. "Staying here, giving up the life you might have had?" "Never," Eleanor said without hesitation. "You saved my life that day, Jackson, but you gave me so much more than that. You gave me a home, a family, a love I did not know existed. How could I ever regret that?" "I was supposed to be hunting elk," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Best elk you never caught," she said, repeating the old joke, and they both laughed. Thomas came home that Christmas with a young woman he introduced as his fiancée, a teacher from San Francisco with kind eyes and a quick smile. Sarah brought news that she had been accepted to medical school in the East, the first woman from Eureka to achieve such a thing. James had designed and built a house in town that everyone was talking about, his reputation growing. The cabin was full of people and noise and joy, and Jackson and Eleanor sat at the head of the table watching their children with pride and wonder. Late that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Jackson and Eleanor sat by the fire like they had done 1,000 times before. He was grayer now, the red in his hair fading to silver, and Eleanor had laugh lines around her eyes and mouth. But when he reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together, the connection was as strong as it had ever been. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly. "For what?" "For riding out in that storm, for not giving up on us, for building this life with me." Jackson brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "Eleanor, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. Finding you in that snow was not chance, it was not luck. It was meant to be. We were meant to be." She leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the flames dance in the hearth. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white, but inside they were warm and safe and together. 20 years had passed since that terrible December day when she collapsed in the snow with Thomas in her arms, certain she was going to die. 20 years of love and laughter, of challenges and triumphs, of building a family from the ashes of tragedy. Thomas married his teacher the following spring in a ceremony at the cabin, the whole town of Eureka coming up the mountain to celebrate. Sarah left for medical school in the fall, determined and brilliant, writing long letters home about her studies. James married a local girl and built them a house just down the valley, close enough to visit regularly. The grandchildren started arriving soon after, and Jackson and Eleanor embraced their new roles with joy. By 1900, they were grandparents 5 times over, the cabin always full of visiting children and grandchildren. Thomas had become a professor, Sarah practiced medicine in Portland, and James had built half the new houses in Eureka. They were successful and happy, and they all traced their good fortune back to that snowy December day when their mother collapsed with Thomas in her arms and a cowboy who should have been hunting elk found them instead. Eleanor was 52 when she fell ill with pneumonia in the winter of 1902. For weeks she lay in bed, her breathing labored, and Jackson sat beside her every moment he could, holding her hand and telling her stories about their life together. The children came, gathering around her bedside, and she told each of them how much she loved them, how proud she was of who they had become. But as winter gave way to spring, her strength returned, and by April she was back on her feet, thinner and weaker but alive. "You scared me," Jackson said one evening, holding her close. "I thought I was going to lose you." "Not yet," Eleanor said firmly. "We have more years together, Jackson Ellis. I did not survive that blizzard just to leave you now," and she was right. They had another decade together, watching their grandchildren grow, celebrating anniversaries and holidays, growing old together in the cabin where their love had begun. They took walks in the forest, slower now but still holding hands like newlyweds. They sat on the porch in the evenings, watching sunsets paint the sky, and talked about everything and nothing. Jackson died peacefully in his sleep in the autumn of 1912. Eleanor curled against his side like she had been every night for almost 40 years. She woke to find him gone, and the grief was crushing, but she did not regret a single moment they had shared. At his funeral, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, she told the story one more time about the cowboy who found a woman and baby dying in the snow and saved them both. About how that single act of courage and compassion had created a legacy of love that would endure for generations. Eleanor lived 5 more years, spending her last days in the cabin surrounded by family. Sarah, now a respected doctor, tended to her mother with gentle hands, and Thomas read to her from the books they both loved. James brought his children to visit, and they filled the house with noise and laughter. On a sunny afternoon in May of 1917, with all her children gathered around her bed, Eleanor closed her eyes for the last time, a smile on her face. They buried her next to Jackson on the hill overlooking the valley, the same view they had loved for so many years. Thomas spoke at the service, telling everyone who had gathered about his earliest memory, about being cold and scared and then suddenly warm and safe in a stranger's arms. About growing up with the best father a boy could ask for, a man who was not his blood but loved him like he was. about a mother who survived impossible odds and built a life filled with love and purpose. The cabin stood for another 50 years, home to James's descendants, before it finally succumbed to time and weather. But the story lived on, passed down through the generations, about the blizzard and the cowboy and the love that bloomed from tragedy. About Eleanor and Jackson, who found each other in the worst possible circumstances and created something beautiful that would last long after they were gone. In every retelling, the message was the same: that love can come from unexpected places, that one act of kindness can change everything, that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us exactly where we are meant to be. That a woman who collapsed in the snow with her baby in her arms and the cowboy who found them both had written a love story for the ages, one that would be remembered and celebrated as long as anyone who carried their blood walked the earth.